Sorry.
So I'm going live now. So
we just need to give everyone the notification that we will be about to go live, and this will be broadcast as well on our YouTube channel. So you will be able to find it later. However, if you're under 18 or you don't want your video taken, or mum and dad haven't given permission, please just close your camera down if you may. That would be fine. And I will keep letting people in. Thank you.
Okay, so you're now live. We're now live on the YouTube channel. So today we're going to have a bit of a talk from two of our more experienced iNaturalists in Australia. We're going to have a talk from Thomas and Pete, so the beachcomber and possum Pete, basically on beachcombing and rock pooling, and a little bit of an introduction to using some iNaturalist features, I guess, as well. So I'm going to hand over to Pete, I believe, and let you take over.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And it's really great to see so many here tonight for this show. And I'm sure there's a mix of experiences, experience levels with Naturalist. Some will be new and some will have had some experience, but I get the feeling that everybody here has an absolute love for rock pools and the beach and beachcombing and probably observing nature as well. So basically that's what my presentation is going to cover, my love of the rock pools and love of biodiversity and observing it, and why I love that everybody here using iNaturalist as a record keeper for my observations and as a way to contribute to the scientific knowledge of the species that I observe. My love of the rock pools. And if anybody has questions throughout, please do put them into the chat and we'll try and cover that as we go. So Stephen, can you give me the thumbs up that you can see my shared screen or Beachcomber?
All good.
Good. Oh, I like that. So up to about March this year, this was my regular job, getting out and about and showing people the environment of the surf coast in Victoria along the Great Ocean Road. It's a privilege to have this job, and as a biologist, it's my passion, and I hope that shines through in the groups that I lead. It certainly captured the imagination of those two teenage boys who are often a user group that are hard to engage, but they were caught by the bug of rock pool rambling that day, and they really got into it, which was really nice to see. All I had to do was tackle that extremely massive crab and let it bite me a few times, but that was a fun experience for me too. Paige is a local girl, and she's an absolute fan of getting out and about, and she's holding the same species of crab, although it's a little bit of a cheat photograph, that one, in that she's just holding the empty exoskeleton, but doesn't it look real? I work for the Great Ocean Road Coastal Committee and as the Environmental Education Program Coordinator. And you can look at my observations on iNaturalist by searching for Possum Pete. There is a big story behind that, of course, and basically I just tracked possums around the Victorian bush for several years and did research on them and research on gliders, but that could be a different presentation. It was an amazing period of nocturnal life for me. Come on. Thank you. So I'll go over the biodiversity of the rocky shore, the intertidal zone, and that's the name we could call it because it is actually land within that space where the tide goes in and covers up the rock shelf, and then it recedes, and that's when we can explore the rock pools. We could still explore them if we get a wetsuit and snorkel on, of course, if the tide's in, and that would be a different different group of species we would see, but there's something magical about going out on low tide and looking at these rock pools in this way when the tide is low. I'll cover some best practice, which is both for the protection of the flora and fauna, the environment there, but also for us. There's definitely some safety considerations we need to take into account when we go into the rock pools. They are an environment that have some risk, but generally speaking, they can be controlled. And although I've had maybe, I couldn't estimate how many times I've led groups out into the rock pools, we've never had serious injuries before. And a quick chat about making observations and photography tips. I'll pretty much talk about that throughout. All right, so straight off the bat, I'll start off with these incredible creatures, the crabs, probably my favorite, although I do tend to say that a lot about everything. So perhaps they're all my favorites, or I don't have any particular favorites. I think it's more logical to put crabs first because they belong in the phylum Arthropoda. And Arthropoda is the most biodiverse phylum of animals on Earth. That is where the most different species of life can be found in this group we call Arthropoda. They're characterized by hard exoskeletons, jointed appendages, and segmented bodies. They're in part of class, the crabs are part of class Decapoda, which means 10 feet. Now, arthropods also encompass the insects as well. So that's why we have such a huge amount of diversity from in the arthropod group. Now, if you were to take a photo, one of these particular photos, and we've got the nice red rock crab there, and also the mottled shore crab, and hiding behind there is the seaweed decorator crab, the ultimate camouflage animal. Very tricky to find in the rock pools because all it does is snip off bits of seaweed, attach it to its body, and hides in amongst the rock pool. Now, if you take a photo of one of these, you don't necessarily know that it's a decorated crab, you don't know that it's a shore crab there, or you don't know that it's the red rock crab. That's totally fine. If you upload that to iNaturalist, you could upload it as life, which somebody would come along eventually and say, oh no, that's a crab. But now you all know that they are in phylum Arthropoda. So you could put that down and iNaturalist would recognize it. Or you could put order Decapoda. So when you upload this to iNaturalist and it says, what did you see? You can say decapod like that. And so then all of the experts or just the crab lovers around the world will get a little alarm going off if they've set one that says, so-and-so in Australia just observed a decapod, and they're going to want to see it. So they're going to go in, they're going to go, oh, I've identified that before, this is what you've seen. So that's one way to do it. Now, the next most diverse phylum group of animals in the world are the mollusks, mollusca. Now, I didn't just say snails here because obviously there isn't just snails there, is there? There's the, in the top right there, the dog whelks. They're called Dicotheus orbiter, and they're carnivorous snails. They'll actually use their radula, which is like a tongue appendage, to drill through the shells of other snails, and then inject some chemicals to break down the body and, as I like to say, suck their guts out. If you ever find a shell on the beach with a perfect circle in it, and Beachcomber can talk about this one later, it's been drilled by one of these carnivorous snails. Then you've got the herbivorous ones on the bottom layer there, the black nerite snail, and also that one, that's called the elephant snail. And it gets these long antennae that look like tusks, and basically it's huge, which is why we call it the elephant snail. obviously they aren't all snails though, are they? The snails are class gastropoda, which are so diverse around the world. But there's that incredibly large octopus there too, called the Maori octopus. You do have to go out at night into the rock pools if you want to have a chance of seeing one of these, usually. I've seen some they've been caught by the low tide in the day and they're getting baked in the sun, and I'll try and gently pick them up and put them into a rock pool. They generally change color and wave their tentacles in thanks. No, not really, but I like to imagine. They're called cephalopods. Cephala means head, pods means foot, head and a foot. And look at that, it really looks like that is what they're made up of, that big mantle, head area, and then all of those legs. Gastropods, you might recognize gastro, that's stomach. So these snails, their name means stomach and foot. Let's not forget the other end of the spectrum too. We're talking biodiversity here, which isn't just animals. And one of the most diverse things you can see in the rock pools is seaweed. There's so many different types, and it's an area that can be studied so much more. I do have an expert friend in Adelaide. He did his PhD on seaweeds, and his wife, they both were seaweed phycologists, and they just named species after species because every time they went diving and collecting, they would find new species of seaweed. They're very, there's so many of them and not enough people study them. However, few of these on this page, I can tell you what they are. The top one here, with those crinkly brown leaves, that's called the golden kelp or leather kelp, Echinoderms radiata. And the interesting thing about this one is that I'll collect it when it's fresh, dry it out on my clothesline and snip it into bits when it's dry and add it to my bolognese or stir fry. It's really quite palatable and nice to eat. The other one below it in Victoria and Tasmania is the biggest seaweed going around. That's called bull kelp, Dervilia potatorum. And possibly all of us here in this Zoom have used this one today in either our cooking or in our cosmetics. This is commercially harvested, dried out and powdered and put into a whole host of products to be used as an emulsifier. So it's a really important one, but in the environment, it acts as an underwater rainforest, an underwater forest for many species to exist in. It's a wonderful one to go snorkeling with as well. This one in the bottom inset here, it looks like balloons. It doesn't have a common name. It's Gloiosacchion brownii, but my kids have the best time just picking it up, squeezing it, and it just explodes with mucus everywhere. It is a fun, disgusting one when it washes up on the beach. But when it's growing in place, it's thought that that mucus inside it might be an anti-herbivore defense against the snails which would eat it. And above, we have a feather-like red seaweed, which I can't remember the name of, and it also hasn't been confirmed in iNaturalist. Nobody can actually tell me exactly what that one is. So with seaweed, we've got these three main types: the green, the brown, and the red. The two large ones here are the brown ones. These two ones here are the red ones, and I'll show you the green one. This is Codium fragile perhaps, and it's just a lot of fun. It gets called sea velvet because its texture is really soft. Those sort of finger-like appendages are anything like a sponge or a seaweed that has those finger-like appendages tends to get called dead man's fingers, probably as a reference to the perilous sailing history of a lot of coasts and a lot of drowned people. But I like to call it green dreadlocks for obvious reasons. I guess that's my take-home message down in the corner there, that one of the main things to do when you go out into the rock pools or on the beach is to have fun. The best practice when you're out there is to tread lightly in what is a fragile environment. So try to roll over the rocks to look under and find out what's there. That's where the life will be living. But then take your time to roll them back gently and carefully into the place where you found them. If you want to, you can pick a lot of the animals up, only if you know that it's safe to do so. But then put them back in their home range. Show somebody else, sure, but then put them back where you found them. That's just best practice. And it comes down to the mindset that we have when we go out into these environments. Are we going out with respect and appreciation? Or are we not quite there yet? Everyone wants to go out and enjoy and have fun, but it's a very easy thing for us to then go the next step and say, well, let's make sure that these animals would invite us back again if they had the choice. Let's be the best visitors we can be. Try to step on the bare rocks instead of trampling seaweed beds. Sure, that's a good idea as well. But sometimes it's not possible. Safety best practice for us is if we do actually step on seaweed beds, it's going to be pretty slippery. So try not to hurt yourself by falling over, and just be aware that wet rocks probably mean that's where the water is washing over. So try to stick on the dry rocks. So wearing sandals or wetsuit booties, or even shoes that you can get wet. Thongs, I find, aren't quite as stable, and bare feet, you would potentially cut your foot on sharp rocks or mussel shells. Don't touch dangerous animals or anything you aren't sure about. So I've got a lifetime of experience, and I know how to pick up a large crab. Some of them could break the skin if they pinched my fingers. And there are some animals that I would absolutely not touch, which I will show you in a moment. It's a good idea to be able to see your 10 fingers and your 10 toes when you're going out there, and please carry a first aid kit with you as well, just in case you have a injury. There's a little link to a YouTube there I'll put in the chat. It's just an video of myself and my sons going out on a rock pool ramble and trying to demonstrate best practice when we're there. So here I've found this decorated crab with its amazing seaweed decoration. I've just returned it to the rock pool where I found it. And from there, you can see that anybody walking past might actually miss it. It's a very tricky animal to spot, and usually the first time you see it, it's because there's a little bit of seaweed walking around on the bottom of a rock pool. Fascinating and lovely creatures. Here's the one that we should never touch, and it would be amazing to see these, but they are certainly a hands-off animal. In all my time going out into the rock pools since I was a little kid, I've only ever seen 5 of these. The 5th was recently, so I used to say I've only ever seen 4, and half of those incidents were close calls. One of them, I was snorkeling with a group, and I picked up an old dog ball that had a hole in it, and it happened to be a blue-ringed octopus home. So when I threw it to the teacher, who was on the beach, she screamed at me, "Pete, what did you do that for?" Because the tentacles started to come out, and it was amazing. We all got to see this blue-ringed octopus as it emerged out of the old dog ball, but it was a close call. This one here is a small one. It's only about the size of a 50-cent piece.
Yeah, come on.
Mom, look!
There's some excited kids there. And you can see that is in the day. It's unusual.
Mom, look!
Actually, we hadn't found that much on that rockpool ramble, and then suddenly, out in the open, there's this blue-ringed octopus swimming along. All right, so photography. I hope you've noticed that in the photos that I've been showing you of the animals that I've wanted to talk about, the photos have shown the animal. And they're the photos that I've uploaded to iNaturalist. And I've pulled them back down off iNaturalist for this presentation. Now, this is a beautiful photograph of a rock pool. I'm quite proud of it. I think it looks really nice. However, if Thomas, the beachcomber, was to give this an out of 10 score for a photo to upload to iNaturalist, I'm sure he'd give it a 1 or a 2. It's not a good photo to upload to iNaturalist. Why? Because it shows how many species? 10, 15, perhaps more. There's the large bull kelp there in the corner. That's an obvious one, but it's not center of screen. I wouldn't know that the person is talking about that if they uploaded this. There's all of these green seaweeds, there's red seaweeds, and right in this corner of the bottom of the rock pool there's a red blob. And that's actually an ascidian, a sea tulip. It's an animal, a sessile animal, so it's stuck on the rock. It's actually a very distant relative of humans, that it comes into the same class, the same phylum group of animals as humans does. So this you wouldn't upload to iNaturalist. You'd try to zoom in and get a much closer picture of the animal or the plant or the organism that you want to have identified, and that would make the best observation. And that is the end of my presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pete. Does anyone have any questions for Pete? You can put them in the chat. Let me just check YouTube. None at the moment. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat and I will be sure to ask Pete or Thomas for you at the end. Thank you.
Cool. That's a question, because I didn't cover sea stars, right? There's sea stars are that amazing group of creatures you can find at the rock pools too. This one behind me is the biscuit star, and it's a very photogenic one. I have to admit, this one's had a little bit of Photoshop touch up, but not much. They really have this incredible symmetry and lovely diversity of colors amongst them. The biscuit star. Along the surf coast, you can find maybe 5 other species of sea stars commonly, and sometimes rarer ones do wash in occasionally, but this is one of the common ones to find.
Thank you very much.
I think that one more thing.
One more? Yep.
Jill? Yes, it's often good to take out a small bucket or one of those clear takeaway containers, because it does allow you to potentially put the animal in to investigate and photograph and then put back. One other thing that I should have mentioned, it's really good to have wet hands if you're handling any of these creatures. A lot of them will be defending against predators, but the main thing they have to defend themselves against when the tide goes out is drying out. So if you pick them up with dry hands, you're actually taking away some of the moisture that they require.
Pete, Meredith actually asked you as well, have you got any tips for photographing animals underwater when you're above the water?
Have a not windy day. not windy night, because the ripples on the water will mess around with your focus. If it is an animal that you're able to reach down and pick up, or a shell, then that's a solution. But if it's not, you can try your best to get the best possible photograph you can. Maybe using your flash might help if you get the right angle, so it doesn't go, the water doesn't reflect back into the image. But the other thing I should have mentioned, the last picture I showed you of all of those different creatures, it's a pretty picture, but animals can be identified from fuzzy, out of focus, blurry pictures. And one of my most embarrassing iNaturalist encounters was when I took my SLR camera, my new underwater housing, went out and took hundreds of photos of fish, and I thought, this is going to be great. And I got back and not one of them was in focus. And it was absolutely terrible. I was a bit embarrassed to put them up on iNaturalist, but the fish enthusiasts, and there are a lot, iNaturalist is very strong for fish, they were able to identify them. And that actually is what counts. So I think let's go on with you, Thomas, and if there's any other questions later, we'll cover them then.
Yeah, no worries, for sure. I'll just quickly answer Deborah's one question. She said, what about wearing gloves so that you're not getting sunscreen, etc., on the specimens? Yeah, that is a good idea, although I find that, like, if you're using plastic gloves, for example, those can also have chemicals in them that can interfere with a lot of the creatures you're picking up. A lot of the times what I'll actually do is I'll put my sun cream on when I'm at home, and then I'll actually use a wet cloth to clean off the underside of my hands so that I'm able to pick things up. But that's definitely a really good thing to consider, especially if you're around things like corals, which have been shown to react poorly to certain sun creams with particular chemicals in them. All right, so I'll share my presentation. All right, you guys able to see that? Sweet.
Yes. Yes, all good.
Awesome. So great to see so many people joining in with the call. I'm Thomas, I'm from Sydney. And for those of you who use iNaturalist, you've probably seen me around. I'm the beachcomber on iNaturalist. And whilst Pete has covered all of the rocky shores and the rock pools, I'm pretty much going to talk about open ocean beaches today. So really, if you look at most kind of beaches, not just in Australia, but anywhere around the world, you can mostly divvy them up into those rocky shores. And then the second type is these really nice open ocean beaches. So open ocean beaches are one of my favorite habitats, particularly along the coastline. And they're typically very long. They're typically relatively wide as well compared to rock pools and rocky shores. So the beach I've got in the shot here is from the mid-north coast on New South Wales, about 20 kilometres south of Port Macquarie. And it doesn't look that wide, but this beach is actually about 120 metres wide right now. And it's about 3.2 kilometres long. So open ocean beaches are usually very big. And they have a few major differences from the rock pools. You'll notice that with rock pools, you tend to get a much greater diversity of species. And that's because there's a lot more habitat. So you can really consider a lot of these open ocean beaches as a bit of a desert, right? So on the beaches themselves, there really isn't that much that you can find that's alive. You get beach spinifex, you get crabs like ghost crabs, and you get a lot of small things, small insects like flies. But really, open ocean beaches are quite a depauperate and nutrient poor environment. And what that means is that all of the interesting and cool things that you find up are things that have washed up from a shore. And because of that, open ocean beaches I've found are the one environment that you can find absolutely anything from anywhere. So another feature associated with open ocean beaches is that they generally have quite powerful waves and strong surf, at least compared to rock pools, right? And because of these big, powerful waves, it means that they can bring a whole lot of interesting finds from really far offshore. So whilst open ocean beaches generally won't have as many species as you'll find on rock pools across all of the groups, so whether you're looking at mollusks or seaweed or crabs or whatever you're interested in, open ocean beaches won't be as diverse, but they do tend to throw up these really cool finds that you don't find anywhere else, particularly after really big storms or periods of really rough surf and swell. So one thing you will notice on open ocean beaches is that because of those large waves, the shells often get smashed up and smashed to bits. But they also often wash up in these massive deposits. So open ocean beaches are really cool for this, where you might be walking along for 100 meters, 200 meters, a kilometer, and it might be completely bare sand. And then all of a sudden you come to this massive deposit that might be 30 or 40 meters across, and it's got tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands inside that deposit. And that's why I love open ocean beaches so much, because you can literally sit down on the beach and walk 5 meters in the space of half an hour or an hour. And in that time, you can just continually be finding new species. And just every time you inch forward another centimeter, you're seeing something new. And that's what I love so much about them. So pretty much what I'll do in the talk tonight for the next half an hour is I'll give a bit of an overview of these open ocean beaches, as I've already done. And then I'll go through some of the individual groups, just like Pete did, and talk about what you're likely to find on these open ocean beaches, how to take photos of them, how to handle them and collect them. And then I'll go through a few of my really interesting finds at the end. So as I said, open ocean beaches tend to not have as many species as these rocky shores, but they do often have these really large, rich deposits that can wash up. So I guess if I was to sum up open ocean beaches in one phrase, it would probably be rocks or diamonds, right? So a lot of the time when you're going to an open ocean beach, you come home empty-handed, right? I can walk for kilometers and kilometers along the beach and just really find nothing. But I actually find that those trips where I find nothing make the trips where I find really cool stuff way more rewarding, right? I don't know if other people feel the same, and it probably sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but if I go to a rock pool that I know or a rock platform and I find really cool stuff every single time I go, if I then have a trip to that rock pool and I don't find interesting things, then I feel really let down and really disappointed. But if I'm actually on an open ocean beach and I go for a trip and I don't really find anything, and then the next trip I don't find anything, and so on, and then after 5 trips I have a trip where I find all these really amazing things or these rare shells that I've never seen before, it just seems that so much more rewarding, and it seems like a much cooler thing. But it definitely is that kind of environment where you can't be disappointed if you don't find anything, because it really is that kind of place where you either find a treasure trove or you find nothing. But having said that, you will be amazed when you start actually looking closely at what you can find on these open ocean beaches. And of course, a lot of my experience is from Australia and in particular New South Wales, but really anywhere around the world, you can probably find 40, 50, 60, even up to 100 different species across mollusks, crabs, and seaweeds on an open ocean beach once you actually start looking closely. And not only are there shells, but of course, there are, as I mentioned, these really cool finds that wash up. So on beaches, I've found whales, I've found seals, mollusks, seaweeds. This is an olive-headed sea snake. So this is a group that you really aren't likely to find on rock pools. So sea snakes, when you do find them washed up, there's a few things to keep in mind. One is that the sea snake is probably sick or injured. So sea snakes spend their entire lives out at sea, and they do come to the surface to breathe because they can't breathe underwater. But the only reason they come to shore, apart from a few really rare species that lay their eggs near the shore, it means that they're sick or injured. So you'll most often find sea snakes washed up after big storms. And the really, really important thing with sea snakes is not to touch them or handle them, because sea snakes are some of the most venomous snakes in the world. And there are quite a few species that can kill you if they bite you. So what I would do if you find a sea snake is make sure you get some good photos for iNaturalist, But what you can do is call up your local fauna or wildlife rescue group, and they're likely to have someone who is trained in handling snakes, and they are able to relocate it and possibly rescue it and hopefully ferry it back out to sea, where hopefully it will return and swim away and be okay. So there's really two types of open ocean beaches that you can beach comb along. The first type is the one, I'll go back a few slides, and it's these kind of beaches. So these are embayed beaches. And what I mean by embayed is that this beach at either end has a big headland. Now, I'm not so sure about other parts of the world, but certainly in New South Wales, this is the most common kind of beach that you will find. So it's quite a long beach, as I mentioned. So they'll be a couple of kilometers long, generally between, say, 50 to 100 meters wide. And at either end, they'll have this big headland. And because of those big headlands, it actually helps the water funnel in towards the beach and helps funnel all these shells and interesting finds into the beach. So it's this really nice system where things are floating around offshore and the seashells offshore and all these sea snakes and interesting finds. And then because of the geographic setup of the beach, all of those finds, when they do wash up, they get funneled into the beach. Now, the other type of beach you're likely to encounter, and this is generally in more tropical areas or around areas associated with estuaries or rivers, are these huge mud flats. And these kind of can stretch for as far as the eye can see. So this is a mud flat I visited when I was up in the Northern Territory near Darwin. This is a place called Buffalo Creek. And the water, the ocean, is actually out on that far horizon. So I was standing on the shore and looking out towards the water, and it was so far away that I actually couldn't get it in shot. So this mud flat just stretched for kilometers and kilometers and kilometers. And in these kind of environments, you get this really, really awesome diversity of shells as well. And the reason for that is you're getting shells coming from both the ocean and washing up, but you're also getting species washing up from the mangroves and the rivers behind the beach. So you've got this two-way input coming onto the sand, which is a really cool thing. And so you get really awesome shells like this really nice monastic cone shell I found on this reef flat. And you'll find as well that on these really nice exposed reef flats where everything's really flat, there aren't many scavengers around, you'll find that a lot of the shells that wash up are in really nice condition, particularly for these flat environments. So that's another thing to consider when you're thinking about what to expect in terms of what you're going to find. If you've got a beach that has quite a steep slope and the sand is quite coarse, then the waves tend to be really powerful. And they're the kind of environments that smash up those shells, like in that slide I showed you guys earlier. Whereas if you've got these really flat, really wide systems like this, it means that the waves are a lot less powerful, and a lot of the shells that wash up are completely intact. So when I was at this particular beach, I just had an absolute field day collecting hundreds of these really, really amazing shells, all in absolutely mint condition. The only thing I had to worry about was the crocodiles. So there are a lot of signs all around this creek warning about saltwater crocodiles. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for if you're in the more tropical regions of the world, which won't really apply for this BioBlitz, given its Southern Hemisphere focus. But if you do find yourselves in these tropical areas, always keep an eye out behind you for crocodiles. So this was another really interesting find, a sad find, but an interesting find where we had a loggerhead sea turtle that had somehow made its way into the river and then had tried to cross this massive mud flat back to the ocean, but hadn't made it in time. And this image, I think, really sums up, I guess I should say, gives a sense of how vast and how wide this beach actually was. This trail that the turtle had gone on the sand stretched for perhaps 500 or 600 meters. And with the temperatures at that time, it was around 38, 40 degrees every single day. It ended up not being able to make it. But it did make for an interesting find and an interesting iNaturalist observation. And it ended up being prey for a pair of whistling kites that came down and found it. So what I'll do now is I'll go through each of these groups that you may find on the beach. So the first group is Cephalopods. So as Pete already introduced earlier, Cephalopods pretty much covers squid, octopuses, and cuttlefish. Now, in 99% of the time, you're not going to find the live animals of cephalopods on open ocean beaches. So whilst you do find these really cool octopuses still alive in the rock pools and when you're diving offshore, on beaches, you're pretty much restricted to finding cuttlebones, which I'm sure everyone here in the video has seen at least one of before. So yeah, as I said, these are the kind of interesting cephalopods that you can find still alive in rock pools. But if you're on the beach, you're more likely to find them in this form, which is a cuttlebone. So pretty much a cuttlebone is this internal structure inside a cuttlefish, and this helps them stay buoyant. So they pump gas, cuttlefishes pump gas in and out of these cuttlebones, and that helps them either rise in the water column or go lower in the water column. So without these, they wouldn't be able to control their buoyancy properly. But when the cuttlefish dies and the flesh is eaten by scavengers or rots away, these cuttlebones float to the surface. So they're really, really light, and they've got a lot of air pockets in them, which are filled with the gas by the cuttlefish when it's alive. But once it dies, those air pockets mean that the cuttlebone floats at the surface and then slowly drifts to shore. Now, the one particularly around southeastern Australia that you're most likely to encounter is Sepia apama, and that's the giant cuttlefish. So these are a really, really impressive species. And as the name suggests, they're the largest cuttlefish species on Earth. The cuttlefish themselves can grow up to about 1 meter long, and the cuttlebones can grow to 0.5 meter long. So absolutely massive. So the cuttlebones on the screen right now, these are about 45, 46 centimeters long, which is the biggest one I've ever found in my life. And certainly very, very close to being the absolute maximum size they can reach. But if you start to actually take close notice of a lot of these cuttlebones, you'll notice that there are heaps of different species, and they all have really subtle differences. So if you do find cuttlebones, so these are just a few of the ones that I've found around Sydney along the New South Wales coast. So you can see that even just in a really small area, there's this really amazing diversity of cuttlebones that you can find. So if you want to photograph cuttlebones and upload them to iNaturalist and be able to identify them, there are 3 main things I want you guys to focus on. The first is to get a dorsal shot. So that makes sense. So the dorsal side is this side, right? So this side where my mouse is. So the dorsal side is generally the most important one, because you notice that in a lot of species, they have a median ridge going along the middle of the cuttlebone, parallel to the edges, whereas others have a certain texture or patterns, and that's really important to ID. The second thing to do when taking a photo of a cuttlebone is to then flip it over and get a photo of the underside. Because whilst a lot of the species can be ID'd just from this dorsal shot, other species, like this one, Sepia rosella, also need an underside shot. And you'll notice that this one has this really distinct pink cone on the inside. And as soon as you see that, you know it's this species. And the final thing is to make sure you get a shot of the horn, because that can be really important for identifying as well. What you'll notice if I go back to this slide is that Sepia apama doesn't have a horn. And now that's only in the adults, keep in mind. So if you find a big cuttlebone and it doesn't have a horn, then it's Sepia apama. But the juveniles do have horns. So that's why it's really important to get a good photo of that horn, because its structure as well can help you identify. So in some species, it's curved upwards. Other species, it's curved downwards. In other ones, like this tiny little lamata, it's got 2 little wings on either side. So those are the 3 main photos that you should take when taking photos of cuttlebones. Is one from the top, one from beneath, and with your beneath shot particularly getting the end near where the horn is, and then a photo of the horn itself is really good. Then we've got echinoderms. So this is another group where they're not that common washed up on beaches. And in fact, a lot of the specimens you find are going to be pretty sickly or dead specimens. So all of your live echinoderms, and what I should clarify by echinoderms is that covers things like sea stars, brittle stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and a few other groups, things like feather stars as well. Now these guys, as I said, they're generally, if you want to find them alive, then rock pools are the way to go, as Pete showed you. But you do find someone washed up. So this is, and one thing you'll notice is that they do tend to discolor. So on the left is a dwarf cushion star that I found live in a rock pool. And on the right is the same species, but washed up onto the beach. So you'll notice that, first of all, they start to discolor is the first step. And then when they're totally dried out, you'll find that almost all sea stars washed up onto the beach turn this sandy color. Now, there are a few exceptions, particularly in some really vividly colored tropical species. But a lot of these fleshy sea stars in the Southern Hemisphere, when they wash up, they will end up turning this sandy color. So if you do want to get a photo of their colors, it's better to do it when they're still alive. Perhaps the most common echinoderm that does wash up on open ocean beaches, however, is sea urchins. And a lot of the times these will be the empty tests. Do keep in mind, I should say, always check if the sea urchin, if the actual animal is still inside, because if you bring it home and the animal is still inside, it will absolutely stink. I have a lot of experience with bringing home extremely strong smelling dead things, which my family is eternally grateful for. But sea urchins definitely are in the top 5 for one of the worst smelling things you can bring home, particularly when you didn't realize that you brought the animal home and you thought you were just bringing home a shell. So always check underneath the sea urchin to see if the animal is still inside or if it's just the empty test and spines. Now, this is a bit of a New South Wales and southeastern Australian example, so I apologize to the people watching from elsewhere around the world, but I'll very just briefly go through this because these are the 2 most common sea urchins you'll find around southeastern Australia. So on the left, you've got Centrostephanus rogesi, so that's the long-spined sea urchin. And on the right, you've got Heliosidaris erythrogramma. That's the Western Pacific purple sea urchin. So they're the 2 most common, and the reason I put in this slide is that they can look really similar. They're both kind of purplish sea urchins. The right sea urchin can also have a green or a white form, but generally they're both purplish, both around the same size, and they live in the same areas. But it actually is really easy to differentiate them if you have the spines. So on the left-hand side, if you find a sea urchin, what you do is you look at the spines and you'll notice they've got these scales, really tiny scales on them. And the other thing you notice is if you snap the spine in half, it's actually hollow. And straight away that tells you that it's Centrostephanus rogesi. Whereas if you look at the spines over here, you'll notice that they've got these longitudinal ridges, so they don't have the scales. And they also, if you snap the spine, it's completely solid inside. It's not hollow. So that's a really easy way of differentiating between these 2 similar species. Now, one of my favorite things to find washed up is fishes, right? And this is actually what got me into iNaturalist. So pretty much a couple of years ago, I'd found a few interesting fish wash up onto the beach. And at that time, I was working at the Australian Museum and I visited Mark McGrauther, who was the curator of fishes at the museum. And I asked him if he could identify them for me. And he said to me, there's this really cool website called iNaturalist. You should join up and post your photos there and add them to the Australasian Fishes Project, which a lot of you guys would know about for those of you who use iNaturalist. So that pretty much was how things started, and I've been hooked ever since. But yeah, so fishes washed up onto the beach is where I started in iNaturalist. And pretty much you name a fish that's in the ocean and it can wash up onto the beach. That's what I find so cool about walking along the beach, is that I can find fish from the deep sea, I can find common fish from rock pools, I can find fish that I'd get when I'm going out fishing. You name it, I've found it. So this is a southern roughy, which is quite a common table fish. So a lot of people here have probably eaten these fish at some point in their lives. This is a really nice rock cod, which is found. So what you'll notice with both of these photos is that there's something for scale. So this applies really for anything you're taking a photo of, but I particularly do it for fish, is it's really important to have something in the photo to give a sense of scale, because there are often species that are really similar to each other, but then one species may be really small and another may be big, right? So in this case, I've got a set of tweezers in the photo, and then I can write in the description or in a comment on the observation how big the tweezers are. Whereas in this case, I've actually got a ruler and it's immediately clear how big the fish was. So if you don't happen to have any of those things, what you can do is put your hand or your finger into the shot as well. But as long as you've just got something in there to show a sense of scale, it's a really nice way of helping other people to identify your observations. This was a really cool one I found. This is Xenocephalus armatus. So this is a bulldog stargazer. So this is a really cool little fish that actually sits at the bottom of the ocean. And it's called a stargazer because it buries itself in the sand and then it has upward facing eyes. So instead of having eyes that face to the side, you'll notice that its eyes are slightly projecting upwards. And it'll actually sit in the sand looking upwards. And the reason it does that is it's an ambush predator. So it waits for other fish and small invertebrates to swim past, and then it jumps up, and you can see those really sharp teeth here, and grabs the prey that goes past. And when I uploaded this one, this was actually the first observation of this species to iNaturalist. So this was one I was pretty stoked about. This is a red Indian fish, so another fairly uncommon one to find washed up on the beach. But one thing you'll notice is that most fishes that wash up onto the beach are these hard-bodied fishes. So this is an eastern smooth boxfish. This is an ocean jacket. And this is a three-barred porcupine fish. And what you notice about all three of these fish is that they have these really tough outer bodies. So they've got either leathery skin like a leather jacket, they've got these hard bony plates like this boxfish, or they've got these hard, tough spines like this porcupine fish. And that's a pattern you'll notice when you're looking for fish washed up on the beach, that it's often difficult to find the more fleshy fish or the soft fishes, whereas most of the things you find washed up will be in this group. And the group I'm talking about is Tetraodontiformes. So Tetraodontiformes has pufferfish, porcupine fish, file fishes, trigger fishes, all those kind of fish you associate with this tough, hard body or spines. And the reason that you find them washed up more, there's two general reasons. One is that these tend to be fairly slow swimming fish, and they also can control their buoyancy by sucking in water. And so they tend to be a little more ungainly in the water, and it's easier for big storms to wash them up. But the other reason is that they don't necessarily wash up more often than the other fish. It's just that they don't get eaten. So that's an interesting bias that you can observe on beaches. So other fishes do often wash up, but it's just that because, as I mentioned earlier, remember, these open ocean beaches are very low in nutrients and they're this very depauperate environment. So when a fish washes up onto the beach, it's this really amazing windfall for all the scavengers that are there. So you can kind of think of a fish washing up onto the beach as an equivalent of a whale fall. So I'm sure you've also kind of seen those awesome videos. I think there's been a few on David Attenborough where a whale dies and then it falls to the bottom of the ocean. And then when it's landed on the bottom of the ocean, this incredible community of scavengers all come out of nowhere to feed on the whale. And that whale can feed that community for more than 100 years. And that's because the bottom of the ocean generally has very few nutrients or food available. So when something does come along, it gets scavenged straight away. The same thing happens for fish. When you have fish wash up, those scavengers, like things like seagulls, amphipods in the sand, ghost crabs, they all come out of nowhere and they jump on those fish straight away to eat them. But these fish, right, with the spines and the tough skin, are a lot tougher to scavenge. So you can actually find them on the beach even months after they've washed up.
Hi, Thomas. There's a question in the chat for you.
Yep.
What was the red fish's name, but not in Latin, please? The one that was all dried up.
This one? Yeah, so this is a red Indian fish. So this is one that you can kind of commonly find if you're diving off the coast of New South Wales and down around southern Australia as well. But yeah, it's. I think this is probably the only one that I've found washed up with this one.
Sorry, not that one. Probably go back a couple more.
Go back a couple more. This one?
That one.
That one's a southern roughy. So the common name for this one is a southern roughy.
Yes, that one. Thank you very much.
No worries. So another thing you can find is larval fish, and you have to be really, really quick to get these. So if you want to find larval fish, then the best way to do that is to beachcomb just after high tide, so before the scavengers have a chance. And what you do is you walk directly along the line where the water is. And what I do is I look for glints of silver in the sun. So you'll notice with pretty much all of these fish here, so these are wildly different species and wildly different families. But what you'll notice is that all of these fish have these kind of silvery glistening quality to them. So because these little fish are really small, so you can see from the scale bar in the bottom left, that one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, about 10 or 11 millimeters long. So they can be really hard to see just outright when you're walking along the beach. So my tip for spotting these larval fish is as you're walking along, tilt your head and just look for little glistens and glints of silver in the sunlight, and there's a good chance that you've spotted a larval fish. But as I said, you do have to get in there quick and make sure that you're beachcombing just as the high tide is starting to move back out. So when it's been high tide and now it's starting to go out, that's the best time to look for larval fish.
So Thomas, a question from me this time. So you're talking
Yep.
about larval fish. Is that a baby fish?
Yeah, pretty much. So fish have these generally kind of 4 stages. So you start off as an egg, of course, and then when the fish hatches, it becomes a larva. And one thing you'll notice is that larval fish often look really, really different to the adult fish. And they also tend to have all these wacky spines and tendrils and all kinds of interesting appendages. Then they'll turn into a juvenile, where they're a little bit bigger and they probably look a lot more like the adult. And then you have the adult fish. So all the fish here, they're either larval or juvenile fishes. So they tend to be a few millimeters or a few centimeters long. And yeah, so they'll eventually turn into an adult fish if they survive. And a lot of the time, as I mentioned, they'll look really, really different to these larval fish. So another thing you can find washed up on the beach, and I'm aware I'm rapidly running out of time. I've got too passionate about beachcombing, too much content. So I'll start to speed things up a little bit here. But one thing that you can find washed up on the beach is insects. So these are obviously not coming from the water, but they're often coming from the bush or any kind of vegetation from behind the beach. So this one I've got on my finger here is a species of jewel beetle. This is Castiorina octospilota, a really, really cool species I found. But I thought I'd just highlight that you can actually find this really amazing diversity of insects on beaches. So it's something to look, it's not something you typically expect on open ocean beaches, but it's always something to just be aware of because you never know what interesting find you might stumble upon. So you do find a lot of European honeybees washed up on beaches. And the very, very quick explanation for that is that bees actually need a lot of water every day. And when you have regions that are in drought and haven't had much rain in a while, then the bees will actually go down onto the beach to try and get water. But then when they try and drink the salt water, it hits them for 6. And so you often find a lot of struggling bees on the beach. And that's because they're actually looking for water. You get a lot of cicadas as well, I've found at least, along New South Wales. So these are all cicadas that I've found washed up on beaches in New South Wales. You get a lot of really, really big, interesting insects. So on the left is quite a rare longhorn beetle. On the right is a super rare type of horsefly. And actually, this fly on the right, there are only 3 photos at the moment in existence of this fly. So that's a really cool one. You get, as I mentioned, so here you've got all kinds of different orders of insects as well. So it's not just bees or just flies that you can find on the beach. On the left here, you've got a beetle, and you've got a fly, you've got a true bug on the left, you've got a cicada killer wasp on the right here. So you've just got this really nice diversity of insects that can wash up onto the beach. And the one last thing I will say about insects is that I generally try to show a bit of compassion and save them. So if you do see an insect on the beach struggling a little bit with the wind, getting buffeted by the water washing up, I'll try to pick them up, you know, as long as they're not something I know that's going to sting or bite me, and I'll bring them back to the back of the beach. But if you do want to rescue them still, one thing I do bring to the beach, I bring little dip containers. So if you go to Woolies or your local supermarket, you can generally buy small packs of little plastic containers. So similar to Chinese takeaway containers, but really small circular ones, something that you'd put dip in for like a party or like a salsa or condiment. And you can generally buy like a pack of 5 for $2 or something like that. And I'll actually bring a few of those in my pocket, not only to collect fragile shells, but also to help scoop up these insects that I find on the beach and then ferry them back to the bushes at the back of the beach. And of course, we've got seashells. So this is generally the thing that people are going to beaches to look for. They're probably one of my favorite groups. I've got a really big collection of seashells at home that I've collected over the years. I'm up to about 5,000 seashells now across maybe 450 species. And that's something I'm really passionate about. The one thing I'm going to talk about today, because Pete covered gastropods already a little bit, and there are just too many groups that I'm excited about to talk about. I'm just going to quickly go through the general photos that you should take of seashells, particularly for certain groups. And I am aware I have reached 9:30, so if you guys are busy and do need to leave, feel free. But if you want to stick around, I will go for probably another 10 or 15 minutes. just going through these slides. So on open ocean beaches, what you will find is that bivalves are generally way more common than gastropods. And what I mean by those two terms, so gastropods, as Pete explained earlier, they're generally what you think of as snails, as sea snails, whereas bivalves are things like oysters, mussels, and clams. So bivalves are mollusks that have two parts to their shell. And because a lot of bivalves actually live buried in the sand offshore, then they tend to be the more common group that wash up on beaches. So if you're really keen on finding gastropods, rock pools are generally a better bet for you. But if you're really interested in bivalves, then open ocean beaches are a really great place to look. And not only for shells washed up, but you can actually find live bivalves on beaches as well. So what you're looking at in this picture is actually the two siphons of a pipi. So a pipi will actually live buried in the sand. And what it does is it extends these siphons out above the sand into the water. And with one siphon, this one, the inhalant siphon, it sucks in water and particles. So that's how it feeds. So it gets all kinds of little phytoplankton and zooplankton from the water. It extracts those plankton from the water inside the animal and eats them. And then from this exhalant siphon over here, it expels all that wastewater. So they're a really cool live bivalve that you can actually find on the beach.
Sorry to interrupt you again, Thomas.
Yep.
Just FYI, it's been going on in the chat about where you can and can't actually take shells home from.
Yep.
The idea is to leave them behind.
Yep.
Did you want to comment anything on that one?
Yeah, 100%. So that's a really, really great question. So it's definitely always worth checking when you can and can't take shells. So there are a lot of places and a lot of beaches, not only in Australia or around the world, where it's completely fine for you to take shells, but there are certainly protected areas. So marine reserves and aquatic protected areas and national parks where you can't take anything unless you have a license. So those cases are certainly conditional. So it depends a lot of the time purely on the exact spot where you are. So it's always worth either Googling the beach or looking up on Google Maps just where any national parks or marine protected areas may be in your area, just in case they cover them. There are some states as well that you need a license to collect shells, even if you're not in one of those protected areas. So that's another thing you can check by looking up online in your local council area. But I think my general advice is that even if you're not in a protected area, I tend not to collect many things anymore. So a lot of my collection is built up from a couple of years ago. And if I go to a beach now where I am allowed to collect, in the past, I may have collected 100 or 200 shells. Now I might only collect one or two. And the reason for that is that shells can often be really important habitat for other species. So if you think about something like hermit crabs, they really rely on having these shells available for their homes. Now that obviously applies more for gastropod shells than it does for bivalves. But just I think as a general rule, try to have as little impact as you can. And the really, really awesome thing about iNaturalist is that you don't need to keep the specimen to be able to identify it. That's what's so powerful about citizen science platforms like iNaturalist, is you can take a photo and you can leave the shell behind and you have this great experience where you've engaged with nature, and then you can still identify it when you get home with that photo. And the other thing about leaving shells behind is that it also means the next person walking along the beach gets to enjoy those shells as well. I know I'd certainly be disappointed if I walked along the beach and the person who'd walked 10 minutes before me had picked up all the shells and I didn't get to see them. So, but certainly if you're in an area where collecting is allowed, then by all means, collect a couple of shells that you find really interesting, because that whole experience of picking things up and collecting them and bringing them home and learning more about them really helps people get connected to nature. But always be aware of your impact and try to have as little impact as you can, certainly. So one thing you'll notice with shells is that they have lots of different features on them. And it's really important to get photos from different angles. So whenever you're taking a photo of something that looks like a snail, always try to get at least 2 shots. So one shot on the left from above. So this is a bladder moon snail. So this is a species found all around Australia and in a few other countries like Japan. Always get a photo from above so that you can see this structure, which is the spire. And then always get a photo from below so you can see the aperture, which is the opening where the snail comes up, as well as seeing this area to the left of the aperture. So this is known as the columella. And over the columella is often this callus in a lot of different groups. And this can actually be a really useful tool for identifying certain species. So this particular group, the naticids, they're the moon snails. They're largely identified by this area, the callus and the umbilicus, just to the left of the aperture. So if you only took this shot, then for some species, it can be difficult to differentiate them. So whenever you're taking photos of gastropods, always get a photo from above and always get a photo from beneath. And it's always nice to get kind of that middle shot as well, where if you imagine this shot on the right, but tilted down a little bit more so that you're kind of looking directly to the side of the shell, that's a really nice shot to get as well. So just generally take as many photos as you need, but always get every view of the shell possible, and that will really help when identifying things. Now, this is a really cool thing that Pete actually mentioned before with the Dicathase orbiter, that if you can often find shells with these little drill holes, and this means that another predatory mollusk has attacked that shell, drilled into it with its radula, which, as Pete explained, is a type of modified tongue, and then sucked out the insides of that shell. So there are a few different groups that do that. Muricidae, which are the whelks, they often prey upon shells like this. But you also get this group. So these moon snails are actually very active predators on open ocean beaches of bivalves, and so often these drill holes are caused by them. And actually, if you're in a rock pool and you find shells with drill holes, then it can often also be an octopus. That's the culprit. I'll skip that slide. So a really important thing for bivalves is to get a photo of both the inside and the outside. So a lot of people that are new to looking at shells make the mistake of they find a mussel or an oyster or a clam, and they only take a photo of the outside. Now, in a lot of cases, you can still identify that, but some species need the inside. And the reason for that is that most bivalve families are identified by the hinge. So the hinge is where the two parts of a bivalve shell join together. And the shape of that hinge and the little pockets that you see and the teeth and all the structures, they're a really useful tool for being able to identify shells to family. And then, of course, other structures help you get to species. So just like with a gastropod where you have to take multiple photos from multiple angles, if you have a bivalve, make sure you take a photo of both the top and the bottom. And that will really help people in iNaturalist identify things for you. A really cool group that wash up are the violet sea snails. So these are species that would be familiar to everyone in this video because these are worldwide species. So these are the violet sea snails. And the really cool thing about this group is that they actually float upside down on the surface of the ocean. So these are predatory sea snails as well. So as I said, so they actually float upside down at the surface. And what they do is they make this bubble raft out of their mucus. So they pump out this mucus from the shell and they create this little raft that allows them to float. They float upside down. And what they do is they actually feed, and I'll skip ahead a slide, they feed on siphonophores and hydrozoans. So all the things that you imagine like blue bottles, blue buttons, by the wind sailors, these really classic jellyfish-like animals. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. These aren't actually jellyfish. They're in the group Hydrozoa, which are related to jellyfish, but they're a little bit different. So they generally tend to be colonial organisms. And these purple violet sea snails actually feed on those. So they're a really, really cool group. And as you can see from the next slide, there's actually more than one species. So the main species that you will see, mostly washed up, is this one, the main violet moon sea snail, Janthena janthena. It's the biggest one. It has this pale purple, very, very pale violet on the top, and beneath it's a much darker purple. So that's quite an easy one. But then you'll notice that there are actually all these other smaller species that can wash up as well. And these can be a bit trickier to ID. And this shot shows you quite well the general angles that you should take these gastropods from. So you've got a shot showing the spire here. You've got a shot showing the aperture. You've got a shot showing the back. And this just generally helps to ID. You've also got some other rare species like this Reclusia lutea, which is actually in the same family as these purple ones. But this is a brown one, and this is a really rare species. So this is a really good one to look out for. So as I mentioned, you get these things wash up. And this is a term that some of you guys might be familiar with, and that's the blue fleet. So the term blue fleet refers to these blue and purple animals that float on the ocean surface and often wash up in really large numbers on the beach. So you can find these blue bottles, or they're often called Portuguese man-o-war elsewhere in the world. They're one that all of you guys will be familiar with. You've also got blue buttons. You've got by the wind sailors down in the left. These ones at the top left are a type of nudibranch. So they're also called sea lizards or sea dragons. And they actually feed on these siphonophores as well. Then you've got the Columbus crab, Planes minutus, that you often find hitchhiking on pumice and objects that wash up ashore. You've got this goose barnacle, Dosima fascicularis, which is very distinct. And then you've also got this cool little nudibranch, Fiona pinnata, which is quite rare. I've only ever found 2. And they actually feed on goose barnacles as well. So I'll just about wrap things up there. And what I'll do is I'll end with 1 or 2 little interesting finds that I found washed up, just to really hammer home the fact that open ocean beaches are this really cool place to go to, where you're going to find these amazing things. This is actually a baby humpback whale that I found washed up at the end of last year. I was actually at university at the time, in the middle of a meeting, when one of my friends texted me and said, this whale had just washed up on the beach. So as soon as my meeting ended, I got with a mate, hopped into his car. We drove down to the ferry, caught the ferry across to the beach, raced down, and we were actually able to take all these really cool photos of this baby humpback whale washed up. So that was, again, a sad find to see, but a really, really cool observation to put up on iNaturalist. And the last one, as well, so when you find these really big things washed up, it can be a really cool thing to actually look on the animals themselves, because you can find other really awesome little invertebrates as well. On the left here is a whale louse. So this is Siamus bupus. And this is a really cool species because it's only found on humpback whales. So these whale lice are found on almost all whale species that are around the world. But generally, each whale species has its own type of whale louse that only lives on that particular whale species. So this is a whale louse that's only on humpback whales. And then on the right here, you've got these whale barnacles. So these are really cool barnacles because they actually embed themselves directly into the flesh of the whale. And then finally, I've got this really cool leopard seal that washed up. So not everything that washes up onto an open ocean beach is dead. You can find interesting live things. So this was a really cool leopard seal that I found washed up on the beach.
Sorry, Thomas, just one more question.
Yep.
The question is the louse a crustacean?
Yes. So that's a really good question. So it's called a louse, but it's not actually the same type of lice that you'd find on your body or in your hair. So a whale louse is actually a type of isopod. So it is a crustacean, and specifically it is an isopod, and it's evolved over the years to have this parasitic lifestyle. So I think I'll pretty much wrap things up there because I know I've gone over time. I could probably talk about things washing up on the beach for another few hours, but I hope you guys really enjoyed it and learned a few things. And yeah, more than happy to answer any more questions that you guys have.
There was really one more comment though, Thomas. First of all, thank you and Possum Pete for really much for doing this for us tonight. I think we've all learned a lot. One of the comments in the chat was basically that no one mentioned anything about birds on the beach.
Yeah, that is a really good one. Birds are a cool group because they're another one of those ones where you can find both dead and alive specimens. If you want to find dead birds, as gruesome as that may sound, if you want to find dead birds, and particularly if you want to find rare seabirds, then it's really good to go to these open ocean beaches after a big storm, because a lot of these seabirds in really big storms, they get buffeted by the winds and they get blown to shore, and they'll either wash up dead or you'll actually find them still alive but resting on the shore. So a lot of these really rare things like terns and albatrosses and petrels, all the things that normally are really, really far offshore and that you'd only see them if you went out on a boat, you actually have a really cool opportunity to be able to find those rare species on open ocean beaches after big storms. So birds are definitely a great one after storms to look out for.
I'd like to make a quick comment as well, Thomas. You mentioned like a louse on a whale. Also, I do these pracs every year with some of our students at university, and we do dissections of crabs and also dissections of fish. And we often find parasites on the gills of both fish and crabs as well. So it doesn't hurt to actually have a close look at some of these animals, particularly if they're ill. They might have a really high parasite load, or if you're fishing, when you're opening these things up and cleaning them out, to have a quick look on the gills and just having a bit of a close look at these animals, because they can actually be carrying other animals inside them as well.
Yep, and a comment as well on the chat. Perhaps people can be encouraged to explore iNat for various groups, and if they see observations that are obviously dead, they can check to see if the attribute in the actual post is set to dead. So maybe if someone wants to explain what that one's for. And there's another query here: are the muscle scars of bivalves also used for ID?
Yep. So with the first question, yeah, that's definitely a really handy thing to do. So one aspect of iNaturalist that not everyone may be aware of is that you can add annotations. What I mean by that is you can select from little drop-down options on each observation and give certain attributes to observations. So one particular example of an annotation is sex. So you can add either male, female, or cannot be determined, right, to a particular observation. Or there's an annotation for life stage. So for example, if you find a caterpillar, then you can annotate that as larva. Whereas if you found a butterfly, you could annotate that as adult. And the same thing happens for dead or alive. There's actually a little drop-down option on the right-hand side of your screen for every observation. And you can actually select alive or dead on your observations and set them to that. And then the reason that's useful is that other people can come along and specifically filter and search for only dead or only alive observations. So if you're only interested in seeing washed up seashells on the beach and not necessarily the live animals themselves, you can actually filter just for things that people have labeled as dead. So that's a really nice way of annotating your observations. And you can annotate other people's observations for them as well. And it just helps out people that are specifically searching for things.
And there's another comment here that dead is useful for mollusk when you find a shell, as the animal is likely never alive up on the beach anyway.
Yeah, 100%.
And the one about the muscle scars of bivalves?
Yeah. So not in all groups, but certainly in some groups, muscle scars can be really handy for IDing. And definitely in some bivalves compared to others, they're really prominent. So for example, in Venus clams, so they're probably one of the most common and speciose bivalve groups, then the muscle scars tend to be really prominent. And so they are useful to take photos of. But in other groups, things like say oysters or mussels, then they tend to be a bit obscure or not visible at all. So it just depends on the species. But as a general rule, if just take a photo of it, and if the photo doesn't help, then you haven't really lost anything. But it may have just been that photo that you needed to help ID. So it's always better to take too many photos than not enough. And yeah, I've got Meredith's question. Thanks.
Yep.
So Meredith said, can you search the findings of other people by user or species? Definitely. So you can filter for either of those things, and you can filter for both of those things at the same time if you want. So if you only wanted to see the mollusks seen by a certain person, you can certainly do that. And I'll just add one more thing with the collecting. One thing I should have mentioned as well that Pete mentioned too, always be careful when picking up things. So on the beach, open ocean beach, there aren't as many things that can harm you as there are in rock pools because a lot of the things tend to be dead. But certainly there are still some things that can give you a nasty bite or a sting. So it always does pay to at least give things a little bit if you see a shell and you think it's empty, give it a little bit of a poke first with a piece of seaweed or something, just to make sure there isn't something inside. Certainly if you see any cone shells in particular, make sure you're careful. That really only applies more to tropical species, but there are some species in the Southern Hemisphere because cone shells are ones that can give a venomous sting that can actually kill you in some rare cases as well. So always be careful with picking up things, definitely. And yeah, just to reiterate what I said earlier, at the end of the day, it probably is the best practice to just take a photo and leave things behind in most cases. So it's a different question if you do have a license to collect. And collecting the odd one shell or two that's really special to you is generally okay. But in most cases, because iNaturalist is so awesome, as I mentioned, with the ability to just upload a photo and then someone from the other side of the world can ID it for you, then it's generally best to leave those things behind on the beach, just so that the next person can enjoy them as well, at the very least.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Pete, did you have anything to add? Are there any questions from Pete? He's just put a video in the chat for a rock pooling video that he mentioned. Anyone had any questions for Pete?
That's it. Really, really great presentation there, Thomas. Thank you.
Give it a few more seconds to see if anyone else has any questions. We're sitting still at 31 participants, which I think is awesome. We kind of haven't moved off that for a while. So I think thank you guys for your presentation. If anyone else would like to unmute and ask the question, feel free.
Just make sure that if you guys have any questions you think of afterwards or in the future, or you need any help, not just with beachcombing related stuff, but any iNaturalist related questions, definitely feel free to message either Pete or myself or any of us on iNaturalist at any time, and we'll be more than happy to help you out. And yeah, in particular, if you find something interesting washed up on the beach and you're not sure what it is, definitely feel free to tag me, and I'll do my best to try and identify it for you.
Yeah, the way you can tag people, like we've got quite a few new people here. So if you just put that little @ symbol and then the name, that would actually let us know. Isn't that right, Thomas?
Yeah, exactly. So it's exactly like you do on any kind of social media platform like Facebook. You just type in the @ symbol followed by the username of the person, and that will actually send them a notification, and then they can find your observation that they're tagged in.
I'm sure a lot of you know that. It's just some of you might not. So I don't mean to tell you how to do things, but that's something that probably you'll pick it up pretty quickly, but better we talk about it.
Another one here for Thomas. What do the different colored markers represent in the app, red, green, blue?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So different organisms uploaded to iNaturalist, and I'm pretty sure this is correct, and I think Tony can probably correct me if I'm wrong. Different groups of organisms are color-coded. So if you upload a photo of a plant, it'll actually have a green marker on the map, whereas if you have, I believe, any vertebrate, definitely for birds, and I think for vertebrates generally, they're a blue marker on the map. Insects and arthropods and things like that are orange, I'm pretty sure. I think fungi are purple. But yeah, so the little different colored markers, I think this is what Meredith is referring to, the markers on the map, if that's what she's referring to, that indicate the position of observations. They're color-coded for different groups of organisms. And then Gay asked, yeah, can washed up blue bottles still sting you? Definitely. And that's the case with most jellyfish as well. Blue bottles aren't jellyfish, but any kind of jellyfish or jellyfish-like animal, anything that can sting you in the water, generally, it will also be able to sting you on the beach as well, especially when it's just freshly washed up. The same also goes for the sea snakes and snakes in general. As a piece of advice, they can still bite you even when you're dead, even when they're dead, I should say, which will probably make you dead in some cases. So always be careful.
One thing while we're on this, like I mentioned, half of my encounters with blue-ringed octopus had been close calls. One of them was me picking up that dog ball, and the reason I said don't pick up blue-ringed octopus is because on one of my rock pool rambles, that was what a really enthusiastic boy did. He couldn't get my attention quick enough. He'd seen one, a very small one. So what he did was he scooped up a whole handful of sand with the blue-ringed octopus to create a protective layer, but then ran it over to me, and that was still very scary. So he did a very stupid thing in a way to protect, but still protect himself. He was thinking about it. And he's just the one in a 1,000 super enthusiastic kid I sometimes come across on my sessions.
Yeah, as a general rule, I suppose when you're picking up rocks and things, would you advise us to pick them up so that where it opens is away from you, and then look underneath in case there's something there, and it may in fact come out and bite you? I suppose it's more important for things like rocks when you're walking around, particularly in Australia, like large flat rocks. We have to pick it up, and there might very well be a snake underneath or something like that, or a spider. I think
It's
I would
good
assume.
practice. Yeah, to
Yeah.
open up so that the escape is away from you and not
Yeah.
to.
And then putting it back gently in case there's some, soft invertebrates or things like that there that might get crushed.
Yeah, 100%.
Another question on the chat. Can those clear jelly blobs sting? Don't know what they're called.
There's a lot of
So-
different clear jelly blobs that wash up, and unless they've got stingers, they won't be able to sting.
The thing I think Silvana is probably referring to is salps. So in a lot of cases, clear blobs of jelly-like stuff is often a jellyfish, or at least part of a jellyfish. And if there are no tentacles, then it won't sting you. But a lot of the time, when people find these small little, quite regular blobs of jelly washed up on the beach, they're actually these things called salps. And they're a really interesting type of organism that they can form these giant colonies in the water. They can stretch up to like 20 or 30 meters long. And particularly if you've got really big storms, you can often get a lot of them washed up. So they won't sting you, so they're completely harmless. But as I said, it's always better to be safe than sorry. And if there's any kind of thing that looks similar to a jellyfish, even if you're not sure if it is, it's probably best not to touch it just in case.
And thanks to Possum Pete for writing how to spell salps on there. And for Meredith, she says, thank you. This has been a wonderful webinar. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. Can you tell us where the recording will be hosted? So we've actually been live streaming this at the moment, and it's been put on our YouTube channel. So we have a Great Southern BioBlitz YouTube channel. Just go into and look for it in there, and you'll come straight up with it. It's also been put on our Facebook page and our Twitter account as well.
So we might also, it's been recorded live from the Zoom meeting as well. So we might put that one up as well.
And Pascal just made a really good point. Yeah, a lot of jelly blobs can actually also be egg masses from mollusks.
Yeah.
So if you see a big blob of jelly, particularly ones that are kind of shaped like a kidney, there are a few different shapes, but generally like this kind of kidney or sausage shaped one. Yeah, if you really look closely, you'll see that that blob is actually a matrix for thousands and thousands of mollusk eggs. So those moon snails that I had a slide on, they're a really notable group that have these egg masses. So these will often wash up onto the beach, and thousands of little eggs inside the jelly matrix. And then if they wash back out, all those little eggs will hatch out into thousands of tiny little baby sea snails.
Speaking of egg sacs, you don't have a picture anywhere of a mermaid's purse, do you?
Shark eggs.
Yeah, shark eggs. They're an interesting one. We find them up here in Queensland quite often. So you will come across these very odd containers that they're usually a dark colour, and they've got like fins on them, and they're hollow inside. You can't figure out what the heck they are, and they're actually shark eggs containers, or sometimes called mermaid's purse. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if there's no further questions, we want to give a round of applause to everyone. And Mr. Kennedy said, if you find egg cases, then go to the attributes and I'll add egg to the life stage. Then you can search for the eggs as well. So yeah, iNaturalist has a lot of wonderful things you can search for. When you really do start to drill down into the filters, it's a lot of fun, particularly if you do a search for what's already been found in your area. So have a look and see what's near you. As always, thank you, Peter and Thomas. Over to you, Stephen.
Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot, Pete and Thomas. It's been great hearing you guys talk again. You're always very good and very knowledgeable. I hope everyone really picked out some really good bits of information there and learned something new. And I also hope that everyone gets involved in our event coming up at the end of the month and puts a few observations of what they find on iNaturalist and help us make this a very successful event. And hopefully going forward, we've got the City Nature Challenge again at the beginning of next year, and we might look at doing a couple more of these sort of webinars in between to try and encourage people to use iNaturalist, because we hope people find it as useful as what we do. Well, I do anyway, because I always learn something new off of Thomas and Pete. They're very knowledgeable guys, and it's great getting you guys to do this. So thanks a lot, guys, and hopefully we'll see you on iNaturalist soon. more of these sort of webinars.
Thanks, guys.
To try and encourage people to use iNaturalist, because we
I'll
hope
end
they
it
find
now.
it as useful as what we do, what I do anyway, because I always learn something new off of Thomas and Pete. They're very knowledgeable guys.